For those who weren't here last Sunday evening, we're seeking to look at 1,500 years of church history in just 2 sermons. And that means we travel quickly and we cover an immense amount of ground. I don't expect you to remember it all, but nevertheless, I think it's helpful to see the unfolding purpose of God and to see how things came about that we know only too well. Now, last week my subject was how the church captured the world over the first 400 years by winning a physical battle over suffering, by winning a mental battle with heresy, and by winning a spiritual battle over other religion. And one thing I meant to say last week that I forgot to say is very important, and it's this. The Christians won that battle because they outlived, they outthought, and they outdied everyone else. That's not my statement, it's the statement of a Baptist scholar called T.R. Glover. And he said that was the secret of their victory. They outlived, that won the spiritual battle. They outthought, that won the mental battle. And they outdied, that won the physical battle. And therefore they out-survived everything else. Now my subject tonight is much more unhappy and much more serious. My subject tonight is how the world captured the church over the next 1,000 years. There is a picture, a painting from the Middle Ages that portrays the church as a lifeboat. And in a tossing sea, the Christians in the lifeboat are reaching out to pluck from the waves people who are drowning. Now that's quite a good picture of the church. It is a lifeboat, and it's gone into the world responding to the cry, SOS, save our souls. But may I begin by saying this. The lifeboat must be in the sea, but if the sea gets into the lifeboat, then there's real trouble. The church must be in the world if it's going to save people's souls, but when the world gets into the church, then it's finished and it sinks. And the story of the next 1,000 years is how the sea got into the lifeboat and how the world got into the church. I'm going to take it in 3 chapters, if you like. I want to speak of how the world got into the church in the early ages from about the year 100 to 400 AD. So I'm going back into the period we covered last Sunday. Even with all that victory, the world was beginning to get into the church. Then the second chapter is from about the year 400 to the year 1000. And we call those the Dark Ages. And the third chapter, which we'll take after a hymn, is the story of what we call the Middle Ages, roughly from about the year 1000 to 1500, which brings us within just a year or two of Martin Luther. Now, how did the world get into the church in the first 400 years? When there were martyrs like that, when there were preachers like that, when the battle was being won, how did the world get in? Well, 4 things happened during those first 4 centuries that began to water down the Church of Jesus Christ. The first, regional bishops. The second, magic sacraments. The third, established religion. And the fourth, nominal membership. These were the 4 things that began to erode the Church of Jesus Christ, the Church of the Apostles, the Church of the New Testament. Take first this matter of regional bishops. In the New Testament, you saw from last Sunday evening that every church had a number of bishops to itself. That is the divine pattern in the New Testament. They are either called elders or bishops or presbyters. It doesn't matter. The names refer to the same office. Spiritual leaders. And so bishops in the New Testament were the same thing as we call elders in our church. Every church had a number of bishops. Stage number 2 was when each church reduced their bishops to 1. Stage number 3 was when you had 1 bishop to many churches, and the leadership was being concentrated in fewer hands. Now, you can't find that in the New Testament. It didn't happen for the first 100 years of the Christian church, but it happened in the 2nd century AD. And now there emerged men of considerable power and influence, not many bishops to 1 church, but many churches to 1 bishop. And this departure from the divine order in the New Testament was quite clearly one of the first things that began to spoil and to change the character of the Church of Jesus Christ. Now, I fear I may be treading on corns in saying that, but I believe it implicitly. And if you want to know how it did that, I'll tell you privately. It's a long story. The second thing that began to erode the church is this: a magic view of the sacraments. Take baptism. Instead of being an outward sign and symbol of the spiritual washing away of sins that comes to a man when he believes in Jesus, it began to be believed that the actual water and the use of the right formula saved a person from their sin, whatever their age. And that in fact, if you sinned after your baptism, you undid it and you couldn't get it again, so you'd better not. Now, this is a magic and superstitious view. And so they decided, first of all, that they better not be baptized until they were on their deathbed. After all, if you get baptized before you're dying, there's a big risk of sinning afterwards and undoing the good work of washing away your sin. And quite literally, people began to put off baptism until the doctor said there's no hope. And then they rushed for the minister and said, baptize. But then others said, but look, we might have a baby that dies. We'd much rather have the baptism right at the beginning of life and get the baby's sins washed away. We don't want our baby in hell. Now, both of these views were superstitious and magical. And unfortunately, it was the view of infant baptism which prevailed. And so babies began to be baptized about 150 years after Jesus Christ, a practice which has persisted to this day. Not over the majority of churches in the world, but over coming up to half probably. And that practice meant that many began to say, I'm Christian, who had simply been christened or christened. That eroded the Church of Jesus Christ. Similarly, the Lord's Supper was treated magically. It was in the first 400 years that they began to think that the bread actually was the flesh of Christ, and that the wine actually was the blood, and therefore, since his actual flesh and blood were being offered, it was in fact a sacrifice, and therefore the minister handling the bread and the wine must in fact be a priest. And all this idea of the Lord's Supper as a sacrifice and the ministers as priests began at this time, through a magical view of that sacrament of the Lord's Supper. The third thing was established religion. When the emperor went to church, you can imagine everybody else did. And when the Emperor Constantine said, from now on, there is only one official religion, and that is Christianity, you can imagine that everybody climbed on the bandwagon. So they did. It became fashionable, it became respectable to go to the church of the established religion of the country. And I still believe, treading on further corns, that an established religion produces fashionable and respectable Christianity. It's bound to, and I cannot find it in the New Testament. And so fourthly, nominal membership came into the Church of Jesus Christ. And a man writing at the end of the 2nd century AD said this: about 50, he meant about 50 AD, about 50, he was of the church who had received baptism and the Holy Spirit and called Jesus Lord. But about 180, who acknowledged the rule of faith, that is the creed, the New Testament canon, and the authority of the bishops. In other words, people were joining for other reasons than that they believed in Jesus and had received his Holy Spirit. It was now an institution. Now, of course, there were protests, and at every stage when the church went wrong, there were protests. And the two protests in the first 400 years were two movements called Montanism and monasticism, and both of them were protests against a church that was getting wealthy, worldly, and was getting filled up with people who'd never even been converted. Now, Montanism arose in what we now call Turkey and Asia Minor. A man called Montanus noticed that in scores of church members there was no trace of the Holy Spirit. And so he sought afresh the Holy Spirit of God. And there was a revival in Asia Minor. Now, I think if you wanted to know who they were most like today, they were Pentecostals. And they rediscovered the Holy Spirit of God. And the gifts of the Spirit came back into the church through Montanism. And a life came back into the worship, and a vigor and a reality came back through this Pentecostal protest against the deadness of the church and against the worldliness of its members.